Hello, everybody. I'm Marilyn Levin, and I'm from United for Justice with Peace and from the Eastern Massachusetts No Drones Group. We're the main sponsors or organizers of this forum, Dangerous Developments in Modern Weaponry, a forum on the military pursuit of global hegemony. For the past 17 years, the United States has fought in Afghanistan and Iraq with no end in sight. In Iraq, 4,500 Americans lost their lives, and directly and indirectly, estimated up to 1 million Iraqis were killed and millions displaced. Direct costs were 1.9 trillion. Direct and indirect costs in Afghanistan alone are estimated at over 5.5 trillion. The costs continue to grow, especially the burden of caring for over 1 million US veterans, which is estimated to reach $1 trillion. And that's not even counting the burdens on families and societies. Besides Iraq and Afghanistan, the US is involved in wars around the globe, in Syria and Yemen and Somalia, and finances the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And the US outpaces all other nations in military expenditures. World military spending totaled more than 1.6 trillion in 2015. But the US accounted for 37% of the total and spends more on national defense than China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, France, United Kingdom, and Japan combined. With his new proposed budget, Trump takes more than $1 trillion in taxpayer money and disperses fully $750 billion to the military. Out of every taxpayer dollar, that means that 62 cents go to the military and our militarized Department of Homeland Security. 12 billion of this goes to that border wall that we have this crisis with. And veterans benefits takes another 7 cents. So that leaves just 31 cents for all the rest. Health, education, job training, community economic development, housing, infrastructure, safe drinking water and clean air, health and science research, and the prevention of war through diplomacy and humanitarian aid. And if that's not bad enough, this budget cuts billions from non-discretionary funding for anti-poverty programs, Medicaid, food stamps, housing, heating, and job training. At the least. The US has been obscenely prioritizing war and its military since its inception. But now with this administration, it's on steroids. As you listen to the speakers tonight talking about the expansion of dangerous modern weapons, think about the financial costs, what that could do to help people here and around the world, and the costs in human lives, harm to the environment, and potential for existential annihilation, and how we must and can turn this around. I'm going to start with Subrata. We're going to start with Subrata Ghoshroy. Subrata is a research affiliate at MIT's program in science, technology, and society. He spent many years as an engineer in the defense industry before joining academia. He was also a professional staff member of the US Congress and later a senior defense analyst at GAO, the investigative arm of Congress. He became a whistleblower after uncovering fraud in the missile defense program. His research includes the military-industrial complex, nuclear weapons, and a nuclear disarmament. He is the co-author of the book South Asia at a Crossroads, and he's going to start out with an overview of military strategy.
How did we get involved in so much into this mess as we find ourselves today with this incredible military budget that Marilyn talked about and the tremendous amount of weaponry that we build? It all got started during the war, that is the Second World War in 1945. The Manhattan Project, which included many, many top physicists from MIT, Caltech, Harvard, Columbia, and so forth, started around 1939, I think. And And it ended with the explosion of the first atomic bomb in Alamogordo in 1945, July. And that is what cemented the relationship between the universities and science and the military. The drive was always from the Second World War with the Manhattan Project, when we got the atomic bomb and the atomic monopoly at that time. And that lasted quite a few years because it took several years for Russia or Soviet Union at that time to catch up and build its own bomb. But so the US was in an arms race with itself right away, building huge number of weapons starting 1945 after the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so that was what Secretary of Defense Carter, who's Harvard professor, Elaine Scarry, said that was the first offset, meaning we offset the Soviet power by having this nuclear monopoly. But once that was somewhat equalized, then we went on to, of course, into a computer revolution with high-speed electronics and so forth, all funded by the Defense Department. And we call the second offset of precision-guided weapons and so forth. And now we're talking about the third offset, which is the application of artificial intelligence into our weaponry to make it autonomous weapons. And I think Nick is going to talk about that later. So one of the things also is noteworthy is a Manhattan Project that right after the war ended, Vannevar Bush came up with this two-pronged idea that after the war, how do we sustain this economy that is revved up with all the building of the armaments, the aircraft, the ships, the bombs, and the missiles, and so forth. So Vannevar Bush's idea was to continue that path, spend huge amounts of money on defense, and also keep the scientists going at universities to do interesting work. Yes, there is obviously interesting work, even on when you are building weapons. The physics is very interesting, chemistry is very interesting. So it is quite possible, and we're doing it still today, that work is continuing. So we have a two-pronged strategy of that. The industry will hum, economy will hum, and the scientists will get jobs. And this is the compact after the war, and which Eisenhower then called, when he was leaving in 1961, as the birth of the military-industrial complex. And so now we are 75 years or more. It's 55 plus 20, 75 years after the war ended. And now we're in the, and 1991, so it is 18 plus, almost 30 years after the end of the Cold War. And we don't have a so-called peer competitor like we did during the Cold War. But that paradigm that was devised by Vannevar Bush at that time continues today. So massive, massive defense spending. So this is just a pictorial thing of the budget, and you can see that everything else just dwarfs compared to what the defense spending is. But I would just want to point out that a big part of the defense spending is in the research and development. So this big blue thing here is the science and technology and weapons development in the defense budget of 700 plus billion, and that's the nominal budget. And everything else, like where is climate? We are in a crisis. Where do you think you can find the money for climate? It's very small. It's in NASA and it's in the Commerce, where the National Agency for Atmospherics, NOAA, is situated. And that's supposed to be phased out too. So the crisis is here for people, not for the military contractors. So this huge amount of money. So not only the $700 billion defense budget that supplies all the things in the 800 military bases, makes all kinds of weapons, but the R&D budget is also huge, and it's a real slush fund for the military contractors, because you can do pretty much anything in the name of R&D. And once you have the weapons devised with the taxpayer money, the R&D budget, for which the corporations take no risk. I mean, Uncle Sam is the biggest venture capitalist which do not ask anything back from the people they fund. Can you imagine that the kinds of risks the companies can take is enormous? So out comes outlandish ideas of weapons. And all you have to do is to invent a threat. Then you can build a weapon. And that's the kind of cycle we are in, because the incentives are absolutely wrong that the companies take no risk in devising these weapons. And then it also creates this blind faith in technology. This is a kind of a list I produced on my own about the way weapons are used throughout the history after the Second World War, but primarily after the Cold War. Because the Cold War paradigm is okay, you're still spending a lot of money, but the enemy is not there. So we can do pretty much anything. And so we don't have to abide by any kind of rules internationally, whether it's the UN or anything. We just do whatever we want. We can bomb wherever, we can use whatever kind of weapon, and there is no accountability. We don't have to, it's total impunity with which US military can operate internationally. And we see the impact of that throughout the world. And it's especially true, of course, after the horrific attacks in 9/11 in New York and elsewhere, that we actually have a total carte blanche. So we can use bunker busters, we can use these huge G-DAM weapons. We have even a bomb that actually Trump dropped it. It's called the Moab, the mother of all bombs. That's so heavy that it can only be carried by a C-130 plane. And and again, we can just go ahead and do it, and drop it anywhere for experiments. So there's an interesting thing. I mean, there's all these weapons, but this was interesting. This was a bomb that was dropped supposedly in Iraq during the second invasion of Iraq. And it was called an E-bomb. And it was reported by the press. And the E-bomb is what's known as an electromagnetic pulse bomb. So I knew when I was in Congress that they were developing these. There was a congressman named Roscoe Bartlett from Maryland who was very much into this EMP thing. He was on the Armed Services Committee, a Republican. And so they got to test this out. It's some EMP generator. It's a very short burst of microwave that can be generated on an airplane, a big airplane we have, of course. And basically like a radar beam just goes and delivers the energy to TV towers or radar installations and can knock them out. But interestingly enough, this also has a nuclear history. Elaine, you'd be interested in this. And the EMP was first detected in 1962 when the test happened over Johnstone Atoll on the Pacific Ocean in 1962, before we signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty and banned all atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons. And there, Honolulu went out after this megaton burst. And I know I was in Japan recently, and the Japanese have a Lucky Dragon. It's a boat that was on the ocean nearby. They didn't get the notice, and many, many Japanese fishermen got irradiated. So the EMP is an effect of the nuclear weapon blast, and so it can do tremendous damage to the power system. And I don't know if this is something they used in Venezuela recently, because the way the power system went out in Venezuela is very, very interesting. But quickly, how much do I have? 3 minutes. Huh? 3 minutes. Okay. Okay. So let me just do that. You heard about this program called Star Wars, which is a very high-tech Star Wars science fiction project that SDI by President Ronald Reagan, 1983. And I was personally involved. So since I really have no time left, so I just go to show what they were proposing, all kinds of space-based stuff. And this is one thing I was involved. This is a PR shot from the Pentagon. It's called the Airborne Laser. It was a 747 carrying a chemical laser that was supposed to shoot down incoming Russian missiles. And I was in Congress then. I had a special, a confidential report to the House Armed Services Committee saying that this thing is an absolute turkey. It's not going to work because this has not been tested, and you should test it on the ground before going on the air. But Boeing, of course, sold the airplane quickly because 747 is there, the manufacturer, not 737, and this one works. So and they tried to put the laser. And here's what happened. This is the Boeing 747 that should have carried all these incredible laser weapons. To build the laser, you got to make it lightweight and all this stuff. It's a really high-tech system. They couldn't fit anything. They were supposed to be, these red things are laser modules. There were supposed to be 13 of them, ended up putting in only 6, and that even didn't work. So the project was canceled, $5 billion later, no accountability. And this is how they kept the project going. This is Boeing's ABL PR job all across the United States. You have some way of doing some ABL work. So you got all the congressmen and the senators on board from all the states. And so finally, on this note, and we can go into, I really couldn't have cover half of what I wanted to say, but anyway, just the current thing is this plane. It's happening right now. This is called the F-35. It is the crown jewel of the US Air Force, and it is also a complete turkey. It is supposed to be the 5th generation airplane. It's actually not. I was in Japan when I said a few months ago, and the Japanese are forced to buy a whole bunch of them. One just crashed. And tremendous amount of money in going in. But I just found out that there was 99 Congress members, Democrats, Republicans, asking for more of the plane. So let me just go to my final chart and finish my talk. So we ought to be deeply concerned. I just want to make a couple of points that there's tremendous waste in this business of weapon making because it is so profitable for the companies, and the companies fund the people who run for election. And so it is this nexus, of the military-industrial congressional complex, that we ought to be very careful. Pentagon is not accountable. Its books are not auditable. And this, finally, the thing that is so important for MIT and others is that we at the universities are a very important part of the food chain of these weapon systems. This is where the ideas, the seed corns come and germinate. So we cannot say that we're just doing basic science. We don't contribute to this operation that is taking all our money. I was actually going to put the picture of the black hole that has just been observed. And that is a picture of the defense budget. It is sucking all the oxygen in the room. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes. Our next speaker is Elaine Scarry. She teaches at Harvard, where she is the Cabot Professor of Aesthetics. She's the author of Thermonuclear Monarchy, Choosing Between Democracy and Doom.
What scale of object are we talking about when we talk about weapons and weapon production and weapon ingenuity? We might, on the one hand, be talking about something very small, like the physically small, such as the kind of nuclear trigger that might have improvements made in it. Or we might be talking about something relatively vast, like the whole tribe of nuclear submarines. We have, as you may know, 14 Ohio-class submarines. Each one individually has the power to destroy a continent. Earth has 7 continents. The United States has 14 Ohio-class submarines. And I should say that of those 14 submarines, 8 were made, commissioned, and sent out into the oceans following the fall of the Berlin Wall. So after the Cold War ended, they were all built and commissioned in the 1990s. Despite their recent making, we're already, as part of the $1 trillion budget, making 12 new ones. And there's a question about how much about them is really new. The length of the submarine is the same as the Ohio class. The perimeter of the new one, which is called the Columbia class, differs by just 1 foot. The size of the missile tubes is the same, 87 inches. Are they new weapons? It's hard to say. One article published in the Naval Institute Proceedings Journal complains that we haven't in the United States done any new research on nuclear weapons since 1990. And this article worries that we need to keep our talents, our pool of talent exercised. Even if we don't need new nuclear weapons, we might someday in the future. So we ought to be having a whole tribe of very brilliant people working on this, even though we don't need them. Though we aren't working on them, we are certainly replacing them with near equivalents, as in the case of the Ohio submarine replacement by the Columbia submarine that is the first one of which will be completed in 2031 and costs over $6 billion. And the whole program together is estimated to cost between $100 and $600 billion. And there are many examples of this. For many of us in the United States, when we talk about a nuclear weapon, we don't just mean a single weapon. We mean the whole architecture. And this is a quick glimpse of the whole architecture that many of you are familiar with. So for many of us, and you can see that 94% of the weapons are owned by the United States and by Russia, with this tiny wedge owned by the other 7 countries. For many of us, the real opposition is not between US and Russia or US and North Korea, who, by the way, has fewer than 20 missiles, but between the makers and firers of the nuclear weapons and the populations of Earth, between the people who have access to firing these things and the rest of us. What's unique about the nuclear architecture is what happens at either end. The tremendous lack of ratio, the asymmetry between the firing end of the weapon and the injuring end of the weapon. The injuring weapon end of the weapon is unique among weapons for having a catastrophically large number. We know in the recent work on nuclear winter that if even 1/100th of the current, 1/100th of 1% of the current arsenal is used, 44 million people will die on the first afternoon and 1 billion in the first month. Okay, but the other end of the weapon is equally extraordinary because it has a tiny number of people, 1 person, the President of the United States, or 3 people, the council in another country, or 2 people in another nuclear state that have responsibility for firing this. And this is important because the weapons we have, the anti-nuclear weapons we have at our disposal, the anti-nuclear tools we have at our disposal differ depending on which end you're addressing. International law addresses the injuring end of the weapon. It says it's not legal to commit genocide. It's not legal to use weapons that cause disproportionate suffering. It's not legal to use weapons that cross over the border into neutral countries. It's not legal to destroy the ozone layer. It's not legal to destroy the environment. In contrast, but equally important, are national constitutional laws which address the firing end of the weapon and say it's not legal to have war carried out single-handedly without authorization from the whole population and from Congress, something that I often go into but won't go into tonight. Now, there are 2 new genres of weapon that seem to be designed to eliminating or diminishing injury that we hear a lot about. One is low-yield nuclear weapons. The other is anti-ballistic missiles. And both are sound as though they might somehow entail a diminution of injuring. And yet, as you may know, critics and people on the street in general worry that just the opposite is true, that they actually will increase the dangers because low-yield nuclear weapons let us cross over the nuclear taboo threshold and therefore allow retaliation. And the low-yield weapons occur in all 3 of our branches of the military. This is from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'm particularly grateful to Laura Grego for giving it to me to show you tonight. It shows that from 2000 to 2019, one of our major interceptors, what's called the GMD, which is the Ground Defense Mid-Range Defense Program stationed in Alaska and California, has not improved. It's 50% failure rate in each from each year. Sometimes it's 1 ahead on the success side. Sometimes it's one ahead on the failure side, but it's roughly 50% in each case. This is also a film that for shortage of time, I won't show you, but you can look at it on the Union of Concerned Scientists website, and it shows the orbiting ABM apparatus for shooting down missiles. And what it makes clear is that with the low orbits that you have to have, if you want to say intercept something coming from North Korea, you can't just have one satellite orbiting. You have to have 30 in that orbit. But because the Earth is also turning, you have to have many, many orbits. And so just to cover the shots coming from North Korea, you need over 300 satellites in the sky. So it's a somewhat crazy system. The Navy also has a lot of talk about whether the Aegis has any success at all, any serious success rate at all in shooting down ballistic missiles. Because I just have a few minutes left, I want to say that I think it's important to see the situation we're in, not just in the perspective of the 21st century or the 20th century, or even the lifespan of the human species, but a much larger span. And that's suggested to me by the fact that I have noticed in talking about nuclear weapons that one genre of people who are passionate about the dangers of nuclear weapons, in my experience, are astrophysicists. And I once asked one of them, the head royal astronomer of Britain, Martin Rees, how come with all these other planets in your purview, all these other stars, all these other galaxies, like the Subrata Galaxy, which itself contains a billion stars. This photograph, for example, contains over 1,000 galaxies, each of which has billions of stars in it. And many have the planets that seem to have the qualities that should sustain life. I said, why is it that you care so much about what happens on our planet since you're looking out there all the time? And he said that if you have this in your horizon, you care much more because you see how very precious and unique this Earth is. Since so far, we have not found any life out there. We're now in a situation where we're trying to get through the eye of a needle. We need all the ingenuity that exists on Earth. We need all the ingenuity on Earth not to be developing and replicating these weapons, but to doing things like Sebastian Philippe, who's right here, is doing, of finding verification techniques so that we can have treaties for getting rid of weapons, or things like Megan Rice is doing, of just going through the perimeter fences. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Nick Mottern. He's worked as a reporter, researcher, writer, and political organizer over the last 30 years. He's coordinator of NoDrones.com and originator of the Boycott and Divest Honeywell campaign begun in 2014 because of the firm's involvement in drone war. His articles have appeared in truthout.org since 2008. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. It's really good to see such a crowd here tonight. And I'm sorry I can't bless you with any visual aids. And I'm going to have to read my statement because I want to get everything in and do it in my my allotted time. In this forum, we are discussing dangerous developments in weapons, which I choose to divide into two categories. One is weapons of annihilation, and the other is weapons of repression. And my focus will be on weapons of repression, and specifically artificial intelligence as it relates to weaponized drones, which I will refer to as killer drones. I will also speak about the new historic refusal of workers from within the military-industrial complex to do war work. This astounding rebellion was sparked in 2018 by Google workers who objected to creating artificial intelligence software that could and would enable drone killing. The U.S. military has been involved in wars of mass repression, wars to gain control of land and other resources, such as oil, owned by people of color since the founding of the United States. Indeed, the creation of the U.S. was based on an ongoing campaign of genocide against indigenous people. In this campaign and U.S. military repression into the first half of the 20th century, in places like the Philippines and Central America, the U.S. used the same type of weapons that had been used in the large-scale wars between massed armies. However, in Vietnam, the U.S. began for the first time to use sensing devices and computers to gather vast amounts of data about the location and movement of their indigenous opponents, instantly linking this targeting information with aircraft crews who would come in for the kill. The new system, which was dubbed Igloo White, was designed by a group of noted U.S. scientists calling themselves the Jason Group. The purpose was to build an electronic surveillance kill zone at the border of North and South Vietnam that would prevent North Vietnamese soldiers and weapons from moving into the South. Since we are at MIT, I should note that MIT professors Henry Kendall and Steven Weinberg were members of the Jason Group at the time of the creation of Igloo White. For those with technical interest, the electronic border barrier involved a variety of battery-powered sensors dropped from the air that were designed to detect sound, metal, radio signals, the firing of truck ignitions, and human sweat and urine. Drones were also deployed, equipped with optical, infrared, and radar sensors. All the data was fed into a modern 200,000 square foot facility in Thailand, equipped with the most advanced computer equipment of the time, IBM 360 computers with IBM 2260 monitors. The entire Ho Chi Minh Trail operation was displayed in real time, in color, on screens 3 stories high. Igloo White was a military failure against the ingenuity and determination of the North Vietnamese. But that system was developed into what we call today the electronic battlefield. And this was, as was predicted by U.S. Commander in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, who said in a speech in 1969, "On the battlefield of the future, enemy forces will be located, tracked, and targeted almost instantaneously through the use of data links, computer-assisted intelligence, evaluation, and automated fire control." Westmoreland said he was also impressed by technology's ability to find his North Vietnamese foe, who, he said, is naturally elusive and cunning in his use of dense jungle for concealment, not unlike comments from U.S. military people who were tracking down and slaughtering American indigenous people or North American indigenous people. Shortly, I will speak about the student and general public condemnation of the scientists who enabled the U.S. war in Vietnam. Led in part by Science for the People, one of the groups that were sponsoring this forum, and of course you heard about tonight. The next major leap in U.S. repression weaponry is the use of artificial intelligence and the surveillance and targeting of individuals and groups. This is a development that brings us to where we are today, and I believe this development is extraordinarily dangerous, far more dangerous than the creation of the autonomous weapons themselves, because it is through artificial intelligence and the conclusions drawn with it that AI surveillance and targeting is inserted into the minds, quote unquote, of autonomous weapons. From what I have been able to learn, the primary impetus for artificial intelligence being propelled into current warfare has come from the demands of drone warfare. The first armed US drone attack came on October 7th, 2001, the first day of the US invasion of Afghanistan, in a failed attempt to kill Taliban leader Mullah Omar. However, the stealth surveillance, and killing capability, and the positive political profile of armed drones, which is less boots on the ground, established drones as the weapon in the U.S. arsenal of repression, the leading weapon in the U.S. arsenal of repression. And drone operations expanded quickly and beyond Afghanistan. And although the war on terror, quote unquote, is diminishing, the numbers of drones are increasing and the number of drone bases are increasing inside the United States and around the world. In this country, United States, we now have at least 27 drone control centers. And the closest to here is in Syracuse and Niagara Falls. It became obvious immediately that the huge amount of drone video surveillance footage, plus electronic surveillance and human-gathered intelligence about potential targets, plus the expanding number of potential targets caught on drone cameras, resulted in the need for artificial intelligence to sort, classify, and give priority in selecting people to target. That is, artificial intelligence was and is needed to create kill lists. AI is also creating kill list data through facial recognition systems, and other research offers the potential for even more intrusive violations of personal privacy. For example, an MIT description of MIT Media Lab's Emotion AI project says the program, quote, can listen to voice inflections and start to recognize when those inflections correlate with stress and anger. Machines can analyze images and pick up subtleties and micro-expression on human faces that might happen even too fast for a person to recognize. The description notes, however, the obvious complications in coming to human conclusions through machines. Recognizing emotions in an African-American face sometimes can be difficult for a machine that's trained on Caucasian faces. And some of the gestures or voice inflections in one culture may mean something very different in a different culture, unquote. In considering the vastness of the AI drone data demand, we must recognize not only the pressure to add more and more indicators of threat from indigenous people. We must remember that kill lists are almost certainly being created continuously for every nation over which the US operates killer drones. At this moment, these nations are publicly known to include Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Niger, and the Philippines. And we must include other nations in which Western extraction companies have operations or ambitions, such as Sudan. MIT's Lincoln Laboratory appears to be one of the institutions working on AI technology needed to address the monumental data collection and sorting demands of a Pentagon that seeks global reach for its repressive weaponry. Lincoln Lab's website says of its intelligence and design technologies program, quote, we research technologies for processing, exploiting, and integrating data collected from diverse sensors such as radar, electro-optic, video, radio frequency, as well as from people on and the internet. This type of Pentagon research came under a category called Project Maven that brought the first rebellion of Google workers against doing war work. Resignations and refusals caused Google to drop Project Maven in June 2018. In October, continued resistance within Google caused them to pull out of a bid to build a $10 billion AI brain for the Pentagon. This would be a targeting brain, and it was dubbed Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, or JEDI. Amazon and others stayed in the bidding, and the Pentagon announced last week that Amazon and Microsoft are the two finalists for the JEDI contract. This brings us back to MIT, where a member of the board of directors of Amazon, Dan Huttenlocher, has been appointed dean of the new College of Computing that will be set up at MIT. And there has been criticism of this because of that conflict of interest. We know, thanks to Alonso's appearance tonight, that MIT Students Against the War has formed. And one of their major concerns is that the College of Computing will be used primarily towards supporting upgrading Pentagon AI capabilities. I want to get just very briefly into the question of what is the standard of conduct for research? Where should researchers go? The rebellion at Google forced the company to come up with a set of principles for AI work within Google. It includes a pledge not to work on, quote, weapons or other technologies whose principal purpose or implementation is to cause or directly facilitate injury to people. This would include death, presumably. Another set of ethical principles for AI work has been issued by the University of Montreal. And the first principle is that, quote, the development and use of artificial intelligence systems must permit the growth and well-being of all sentient beings. This does not explicitly prohibit weapons work, as does the Google standard. A more forceful demand that scientists not be involved in weapons research was born out of the atrocity and suffering of Vietnam. It was made in 1972 by authors of, quote, Science Against the People, a report on the Jason Group that was prepared by scientists and engineers for social and political responsibility based in Berkeley, California. The last page of that report contains also a logo for Science for the People. The author of that report said, what we say to the Jason scientists is cease all your services to the Pentagon, repudiate the US militaristic policies and corruptions of science in that service, reveal whatever inside information you may have about the military. A question we must ask is what principles does MIT have for its work on artificial intelligence, and indeed all of its research? This is an extremely challenging question because according to MIT's 2018 financial report, the school gets over half of its research funding from the Pentagon. In 2018, that was about 1.09 billion for war-related research, and of that, that was out of 1.7 billion for all research done at MIT. Most of the Pentagon money, which was 966 million, went to Lincoln Laboratory. On-campus research was from the military, $123.5 million. Overall, Pentagon research spending amounted to just under 1/3 of MIT's total operating income. For the whole school, 3.6 billion, about one-third of that comes from the Pentagon. So I have some other points that I wanted to make about the psychology of these weapons, but I think I can speak about that later. But I think that we're in a time when the world is going to have to choose war and repression or cooperation to deal with global warming. The principles for the use of artificial intelligence that are adopted by artificial intelligence researchers, those principles of operation are going to tell us a lot about what direction humanity will be taking. The question I would conclude is, will MIT take the same pledge as Google? Will they respond to the Vietnam War challenge? Will they say, no work on war, no work on killing? Thank you.
Please remember to sign up on to get on our mailing list and to continue sending it around. We have one final speaker. His name is Bruce Gagnon, and he's the co-founder and coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. After growing up in a military family and serving in the Air Force during the Vietnam War, he's an active member of Veterans for Peace and has spent the last 40 years working in the peace and social justice movement. He hosts radio and TV shows in Maine, where he lives currently, and publicizes a blog called Organizing Notes.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here with you all. Thank you for inviting me. The Global Network was created in 1992 and is headquartered today in Brunswick, Maine, where I live. Our website, in case you're interested, is spaceforpeace.org. Military satellites today coordinate all warfare on the Earth. They direct virtually everything the Pentagon does, and they're linked to ground stations all around the planet. So as the satellites orbit the Earth, they're bouncing signals off the ground stations back to the satellites and back to the United States, all in real time, split-second time. And it was in these countries where these ground stations are located, emerged peace groups that became the membership of the Global Network when we created it in 1992. The Persian Gulf War in 1991 was the first space war. In the days before the war began, the United States, with its military satellites, pre-identified all of Saddam Hussein's military targets. And in the first 2 to 3 days of the war, bombed 95% of them. And then played cat and mouse with the remaining 5% of the capability during the remaining weeks of the war, where they essentially field tested the entire US space-directed warfare program. The Yugoslavia war during the Clinton administration was the second space war, where again a field test took place. The United States and NATO bombed the living hell out of Yugoslavia, and they were able to do it because with cyber technology, for the first time, they essentially crawled inside of Yugoslavia's air defense system, shut it down, and they could not defend themselves at all. And so no US NATO warplanes were lost during those attacks. Even the Chinese embassy was hit by the United States in a very provocative move. The United States saying, oh, I'm sorry, we were using old maps, which of course was utter bullshit. Depleted uranium was used in Yugoslavia. And today in significant parts of Serbia, there are massive cancer problems amongst the people in many, many places. And this stuff's going to be around for thousands and thousands of years. During the George W. Bush administration, I listened to C-SPAN one evening and heard a speech by a man by the name of Thomas Barnett. He was introduced as Donald Rumsfeld's strategy guy. At that time, he was the Naval War College instructor in Rhode Island. And he had written a book called The Pentagon's New Map. That evening, he said, we are not going to do international treaties anymore because they will restrict our ability to dominate the world. And so we're going to withdraw from treaties. Security export, he said, will be America's role under corporate globalization. We're not going to make things anymore. We're just going to make war and send our children to endless war. And so during that Bush administration, he withdrew from the ABM treaty that outlawed these so-called missile defense systems that are really the shield to be used after a first strike attack is launched on Russia or China. The Iran nuclear deal, we've walked away from that. Recently, the INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, PAROS, the prevention of an arms race in outer space. Russia and China have been going to the UN for the last 20 years, every year, begging the United States to join them in creating a global treaty to ban weapons in space. Let's close the door to the barn before the horse gets out. And the US refuses through Republican and Democrat administrations. The official position of the United States is, hey, there are no weapons in space. We don't need a treaty. Russia and China have been telling the United States for at least the last 10 years that because of your missile defense deployments surrounding our country, with this so-called shield, we can't afford to reduce our retaliatory capability anymore. You know, Russia and China both have a no first use policy. The United States refuses to develop or to announce such a policy. And so Russia and China are saying, arms control negotiations, we'd love it, but we can't do it as long as you're encircling us with an expanding steroidal NATO operation. And just in the last 2 years, the United States has built launch bases in Poland and Romania for these missile defense systems that will also be able to fire first strike attack nuclear capable cruise missiles that will be able to reach Moscow in 10 to 12 minutes. So what kind of incentive does that create for Russia and China when the United States is ramping up these kind of first strike technologies in their neighborhood, if you will? Where I live in Brunswick, right next door is Bath Iron Works, where they build destroyers. And these Aegis destroyers that are built there are outfitted with these so-called missile defense systems. In fact, on April 27th, just in a few days, there'll be another christening of another destroyer at Bath Iron Works. And I've been helping to organize a protest and nonviolent civil disobedience at this shipyard coming up very soon. In the 1990s, the U.S. Space Command, headquartered in Colorado Springs, Colorado, came out with a planning document called Vision for 2020 that said the United States will control space, dominate space, and deny other countries the use of space. That our job at the Space Command will be full spectrum dominance. We will dominate conflict on the ground with our troops, in the oceans with our Navy, in the air with our Air Force, and in space with our Space Command, all for corporate interests here on Earth, for US corporate interests. I would suggest resource extraction corporate interests. But it's not just Earth that they want to dominate. In a congressional study in the late 1980s entitled Military Space Forces, the Next 50 Years, a congressional staffer laid out a plan for controlling outer space as well. He talked about the Earth-Moon gravity well. Think of a wishing well. If someone is down inside the bottom of a well and you're at the top, you can control their ability to get out because gravity is on your side, you're at the top of the well. In this study, they say with armed space stations on either side of the moon, the United States would be able to control the pathway, the gravity well on and off the planet Earth. And a quote from that book that I've long ago memorized, with military space forces lying in wait at that location, we could hijack rival shipments upon return. So they're already thinking about the day when corporations can go out and mine the sky. They say on the moon, there's helium-3, there's water on Mars, there's magnesium, cobalt, and uranium, there's gold on asteroids. And during the the Obama administration, they passed a bill in Congress and Obama signed it, allowing corporations and individuals in the United States to make land claims on planetary bodies, violating the Moon Treaty, violating the Outer Space Treaty at the UN that say no one, no individual, no corporation, no country can make land claims on these planetary bodies, that space and the planetary bodies are the province of all humankind. So this recent Space Force announcement then would give these corporate interests control of the Earth through the US Space Force. This is their vision. It's provocative, it's expensive. The Pentagon has long said that Star Wars, a generic term for all of this, will be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. And some years ago, in one of the industry publications called Space News, they said, you know, we have to be responsible corporate citizens and come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for all of this, and we have. And they said, we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure that dedicated funding source. And they called it the entitlement programs that officially in America are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the social safety net that Bill Clinton began the destruction of during his tenure in office. These are the programs that the military industrial complex has identified for defunding to pay for all of this stuff. Also controlling, of course, again, the Space Force. One of its jobs would be to control the pathway on and off the planet for corporate interest. So all of this, drones, AI, Space Force, it reveals a corruption of international law, disregard for human life, and most importantly of all, I think, for us as American citizens, a death of the soul of America. What does it say about our soul? What does it say about us as people that we starve our children in order to control and dominate the planet on behalf of corporate interests, and now even prepare to move off the planet into deep space to control universe, essentially, for these same corporate interests? Military spending is drowning out human and environmental needs at a time when our largest problem on this planet is climate change. We must convert the military industrial complex. And when we're protesting at Bath Iron Works on April 17th, this is going to be our major theme. Right now, we're running a campaign across the state, a petition campaign, a letter writing campaign to newspapers around the state, a congressional visitation, and reaching out to environmental groups, all trying to promote this idea of win, win, win. The conversion of the military industrial complex is a win-win-win for labor unions, because studies at UMass Amherst Economics Department and Brown University show that if we convert the military industrial complex, we get more jobs building commuter rail systems, offshore wind turbines, solar power, tidal power, etc. So the labor unions benefit, the peace community benefits, the environmental community benefits. So why in all of our work are we not working together, creating a common unifying demand, convert the military industrial complex, deal with our real problem, climate change? Thank you very much.